Okay, now that you've conducted most of your research and you know what data you're going to use to support which reasons, and you've got a scratch outline, so you have some idea of how you're going to start writing at least your zero draft, it's time to talk about how you actually develop your paper. First of all, everything in your paper has to come from reliable, respected sources. All of your data has to be supplied by the sources that we've talked about, which basically is articles from the databases, books, and some, although not all, documentaries. You may not use .com, .org, .net, or .edu websites without prior permission. You can use .gov websites, and of course you can use the Statistical Abstract of the United States. Do not state your personal opinions or experiences. It's not that your opinion isn't valuable in terms of the real world, and certainly it's not that you don't learn most of what you use in your real life from your personal experiences. That simply isn't considered data in most academic writing, unless a professor specifically asks you to relate your personal experiences or your personal views on a topic. Don't use phrases such as I think, I believe, I feel, I interpret this article, anything along those lines. Now, of course, you know that actually you aren't going to use any first-person pronouns in your paper at all. You're not going to use words like I, me, we, us, our, my, mine, anything like that in your paper at all. So, of course, that leaves out words like I think. But I wanted to bring that up specifically because while it is more accepted in the humanities to use phrases like that, my office where I used to teach was next to the offices of a psychology professor. And he was a very quiet, soft-spoken little man most of the time. And even at that, I would hear him just shouting from his office sometimes. If I see I think in a paper one more time, I'm going to shoot someone, or something along those lines. He actually would never shoot anybody. For that matter, I've had students tell me that they have received lower grades on papers in history classes for using terms like I think. They're more accepted in the humanities. You don't ever have to use them, though, and it's better to practice writing very formally because it's always easier to write more informally than it is to write formally. So make sure that you don't use phrases like that in papers for this class. Okay, so you know that you're going to use data from sources. How do you exactly go about doing that? Well, first of all, these are just my recommendations, but I recommend that you go through your sources again, and if you haven't already, annotate them according to the reasons that they provide data for. And then I've learned as a student for 400 years that it's easier for you if you physically arrange your sources according to the reasons that they support. Now that could either be actually making stacks of books and printed out sources, or maybe it's just putting computerized sources into specific files on your computer. It's just easier if you have them physically arranged, because that way when you sit down to write your zero draft, and and you begin discussing a reason, everything for that reason is in one place. So you can find it very easily, and you don't have to interrupt the flow of your writing in order to find a specific source. And then go ahead and locate and annotate specific passages that you think that you're going to want to use as data to support specific reasons. And you can do that a number of ways. You can use Post-it notes or whatever works best for you. But it's a good idea to do that before you begin writing your zero draft, because again, you don't want the flow of your writing while you're writing that zero draft to be interrupted any more than it absolutely has to be. Now, once you've got your sources ready and you know what data you're going to use, how exactly do you put it in the paper? Well, you use summary, paraphrase, and quotes to do that. In general, don't copy data from sources word for word. Anytime you use more than 3 terms in a row that you take directly from a source word for word, that's considered a quote. Let me explain what I mean by term as opposed to words, okay? And why I use term instead of words. If you think about it, the United States of America, that's 5 words. And if we say that you can't use more than 3 words without it being a direct quote, then every time you use the term the United States of America, you have to format it as a direct quote and cite a source for it. Well, that's goofy. The United States of America is one term. It has 5 words in it, but it refers to one thing. It is the specific name of a thing. Similarly, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, that's one term. The Department of Homeland Security, that's one term. And of course, very, very common phrases like in a person's backyard. That's not a direct quote. That's just a common way of wording something. So something that's that common, you don't have to consider that a direct quote. Pardon me for a second. Excuse me. Okay, now most of your paper will be summary, and we're going to talk in just a few minutes about what a summary is. If you are taking passages of important data and you want to take all of the information from that passage and include it in your paper, that's a paraphrase. And we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. Direct quotes, as you know, is when you use something word for word directly from a source. In academic papers, you use those only when how something is said is important to its meaning, or how something is said is very, very controversial, which you might find in terms of particularly political science papers, although you might find it in other papers too. Direct quotes in academic writing are very, very, very rare, except in some literature classes. The reason for that is because paper should be in your own words, not in somebody else's words. We aren't looking for you to find the best way that something is written and just tack together a bunch of quotes from other people. You are to write things in your own words. So direct quotes should be used very, very, very rarely in academic papers. In fact, you might never use one at all. I've written quite a few academic papers that weren't about literature, and writing about literature is different, without using a single direct quote in it. And as you go through the articles and and even the books that you use as sources. You will find 20 and 30-page articles on some topics without a single direct quote anyplace, especially in academic articles and journal articles. So you don't want to use direct quotes very often. I would say for the papers you're writing, certainly no more than 1 or 2 direct quotes would be necessary. There might be exceptions, though. Okay, first let's talk about using summary. A summary states the most important ideas from a passage in a source. And that's most important in terms of how it applies to your claim. A summary is put in your own words, with no more than 3 terms in a row taken directly from the source. A good way to make sure that you aren't accidentally borrowing language from a source, which is very easy to do, is to read the passage that you want to summarize and then turn the article over or minimize it on your screen and write the summary yourself. Don't have the source in front of you while you're writing the summary. And then go back and check your summary against the original source to make sure that it's accurate. Because the summary just states the most important ideas from a passage, most of the time it will be shorter than the original passage. It can be considerably shorter. For example, if I were writing a paper about literature about the South, I might say Gone with the Wind, which tells the story of a Southern woman during and after the Civil War, was written by Margaret Mitchell. That book is something like 2,000 or 3,000 pages long, and I summarized it in a phrase. On the other hand, I might write a summary of portions of that book that might be longer. It depends on how I want to use the information on the book. But it would definitely be shorter. I am not going to write a 3,000-page summary of a long book. This is very important. Summaries have to have an in-text citation. Summaries have to have an in-text citation. In my literature classes, the people who do poorly on papers tend to do poorly on papers because they're under the impression that you only need an in-text citation for direct quotes. That is not true. You're not just citing that you borrowed words from somebody, you're citing that you got the ideas from somebody, because it's the product of the writer's brain that you're giving credit to, not just the words. So it's very important to remember that summaries have to have in-text citations. Let's take a look at a sample summary. Here is a passage from an article written by literary critic Harold Bloom about Shakespeare's play Othello. Pause the video for a couple of minutes and read this passage. Okay, now that you've read it, let's take a look at a possible summary that might be used depending on how this information is being used by the writer. Again, pause the video and read through this summary kind of quickly. Okay, now what we notice is that a lot of the information that's in Bloom's original passage doesn't appear in the summary. There isn't any information about how that Othello had been considered the ideal of war or the ideal military man. There isn't any information about stabbings in the dark, or specifically what Iago does. Instead, what we have is that a subject of honor, which summarizes this idea that Iago had worshipped war as religion with Othello as his god, becomes a game that is dishonest and secretive, and the dishonest and secretive idea comes from all of these metaphors that Bloom uses in his original passage, and the fact that Iago plays these games in personal relationships summarizes the idea that he plays them everywhere except on the battlefield. So this summarizes this passage. Notice that it's much shorter. It only takes what the writer thinks are the important ideas in terms of the point that the writer wants to use for the paper. It doesn't misrepresent what the author says, which is very important. And it's introduced by information as to who the source is that provided the data. The first time that you refer to a source in a signal phrase, such as according to or writes or states, identify who the source is. Use both the first and last name and identify the source's credentials. After you use that source for the first time in a paper, you can simply refer to the source either by the last name or by the title of an article if you don't have an author's name. So in anytime that the writer refers to Bloom after this, they would simply say Bloom writes or Bloom says or according to Bloom, and they wouldn't have to include all this information about his first name being Harold and his being the professor of humanities at Yale University. We just do that the first time. Okay, now let's talk about paraphrase. A paraphrase, unlike a summary, includes all of the details from the original passage. So you would use this when there is a passage in a source that provides some details about data, and you want to use all of the details. Now, the details have to be presented in a different order than they are presented in the original. Otherwise, you are actually plagiarizing a source's organization. And again, it has to be in your own words with no more than 3 terms in a row taken directly from the source. Again, the best way to write a paraphrase that is going to meet those 2 criteria is to read the passage you want to paraphrase and then either turn it over or minimize the window, write your paraphrase, and then compare your paraphrase to the original to make sure that you've included all the details and that you've included them in a different order than they're presented in the original passage. Now, because you're putting this in your own words, the paraphrase probably isn't going to be much shorter than the original. It might be the same length. It can even be longer, depending on your own wording. A summary is always shorter than the original passage. A paraphrase might actually be longer. And again, it has to be accompanied by an in-text citation. This is very, very important. There are very few things that you can do in writing a paper that will cause you as much problems as plagiarizing. And it doesn't matter whether you did it on purpose or whether you did it accidentally. Depending on the professor that you're working with and how picky that professor wants to be, if you plagiarize, either by using somebody's words and not indicating that it's a direct quote, or by leaving out in-text citations, or by not including the information on a bibliography, a professor could give you a 0 for a paper. The professor also might choose to fail you for the class. Worst of all, the professor could decide to bring you before a disciplinary board. And the disciplinary board could decide to expel you from college for academic dishonesty. A student who is expelled from college for academic dishonesty, the reason will go on the student's transcript. And if you're ever expelled from college for academic dishonesty, you're probably never going to get into another college in your life. So you can pretty much kiss getting any kind of a degree goodbye. It's very, 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 very important to learn to avoid plagiarism. It's probably the most important thing that you will learn in this or any other writing course. And the way you do it is you put things in your own words and you use both an in-text citation and a listing on a bibliography for every piece of information in your paper. Now we're going to talk about the in-text citations and the bibliography in more depth next week, so you will learn how to do it. But it's very, very, very important to remember that summaries and paraphrases have to have in-text citations. It's not just direct quotes that have to have in-text citations. And the reason that I'm making such a big deal about this is because I really do care about you. Honestly, I do. And it would just kill me if I found out that a student who took a writing class from me didn't understand how to avoid plagiarism and then either failed a course or a paper, or worse yet, face some kind of disciplinary action because I didn't explain the concepts well enough. That would just kill me. I would feel so bad for you. I want you to do a really, really good job on every paper you write for every class, of course. And that's why I present the information in this class that I do. But this plagiarism thing, it's really important. So remember, put everything in your own words and always have both an in-text citation and a bibliography entry for every bit of information in your papers. If you do that, you won't have to worry about plagiarism. If your formatting isn't correct, your prof might take off for it, and some of them can be really, really nitpicky about that stuff. But at least you won't be going before a disciplinary board and getting kicked out of school, as long as you make sure that everything in your paper is in your own words and that you have an in-text citation and a bibliography entry for all the information in your paper. And we'll talk about that more next. Okay, let's take a look at a sample paraphrase. Here's that passage again from Harold Bloom. Pause the video for a minute and read it again. Okay, now that you've reviewed the original passage, let's take a look at a possible paraphrase. Again, we're going to assume that this is the first time that Bloom has been referred to in the paper, so we would introduce him with both his first name, his last name, and an identification of who he is. And remember when we studied capital letters, we learned that if someone's title comes after their name, you don't capitalize it, but of course Yale University would be capitalized because it's the name of a specific place, right? And this is a quick review on capital letters for you. Okay, so that explains why we have this phrase. Notice that it states present tense, as we've talked about before. Now let's look at the paraphrase itself. First we talk about Iago's destruction of Othello. That is, in the writer's own words, this idea of the uncreation of Othello. Then we've got his lies, which aligns with disinformation, and his orchestration of secret assaults and street fighting, which aligns to his poet of street brawls and stabbings in the dark. Okay. And then we have signify that he no longer holds war sacred, which has to do with that there has been a change. There's now become, and that holding it sacred refers to this idea of religion. And then it says, instead of holding it as a religion, which again refers back to the idea that it was a religion, but notice instead of saying that it was a religion, we say that he holds it as a religion. Okay? So instead of holding it as a religion, with Othello as its chief god, and that's worshipped Othello as its god, right? Iago now plays at war, which is a way of saying that war has become a game. And his arena is everywhere except the battlefield, aligns with the game is to be played everywhere except upon the battlefield. Okay? So that actually restates basically all of the points that are in the original. It's in the writer's own words, and it's organized, as you notice when I pointed out what each phrase referred to. It's organized differently than the original. And of course, it has an in-text citation. Okay, let's talk about quotes. Remember, you use them only when the way something is stated affects the meaning in a way that is significant to the claim, or in rare cases when how something is stated is controversial. You can't use a direct quote simply because something is written better than you could write it. Considering the sources we're using, we are working with sources that are written by PhDs and professional writers. Of course they can write things better than you and I can. Then in addition, you have to take into consideration that everything we're using has gone through extensive editing. Journal articles that you download from the database, it takes about a year to go through the editing process, and 4 or 5 different people work on editing the article in addition to the author. So, you know, you're looking at sources that people took over a year to write, and the people that wrote them either have PhDs or are professional writers. Of course they're written better than what you can write in a paper that you only spend a few weeks on, or that I can write in a paper that I only spend a few weeks on. This has nothing to do with your being a freshman and I'm a big English teacher. No, it's a matter of time, and it's a matter of the expertise of the writers. So simply because it's written better than you can write it, no, that's not a reason to use a direct quote. If I ask you, why did you quote this, you have to tell me exactly why. And you have to tell me why the way something is said affects its meaning, or why the way it's said is controversial. And those are the only 2 reasons, other than in papers about literature, that you use a direct quote. And unlike paraphrase, and summary, direct quotes do use the source's exact words. As a matter of fact, you can't change the source's wording even if the grammar is incorrect. Remember that a direct quote is considered anything that takes more than 3 terms, not words actually, terms in a row that you take directly from a source. There are 3 different types of direct quotes: partial, short, and long, and each of them require a different type of formatting. We're going to look at that in a separate short presentation. And a direct quote has to have its own separate in-text citation. Even if the quote is included in a paragraph or a passage of summary that has the same in-text citation, a direct quote has to have its own citation. Okay? And we'll work with that more when we work with MLA next week. Okay, a couple of seconds to look it over. Okay, let's take a look at what a possible partial quote might be. And we have our Harold Bloom stuff again, because again we're going to pretend that this is the first time that the writer is referring to Bloom in the paper. And we see that this is pretty much a paraphrase. It's kind of partially a paraphrase and partially a summary. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to actually differentiate between a paraphrase and a summary. But we have a section here where we use one of Harold Bloom's wonderful metaphors as a direct quote. But it's part of a sentence. It's not an entire sentence. That's what makes it a partial quote. And the entire sentence that is in is: faith is replaced by a dark creativity, according to Bloom, as he works to destroy Othello by becoming, quote, the poet of street balls, quote, as well as a liar. Now, because this is not a complete sentence, and it's not a complete sentence in Bloom's original, it's a partial quote. Notice that it is not set off by commas, but it is set off by quotation marks. We have an in-text citation for this partial quote, even though the page number that the partial quote comes from is included in the citation at the end of the paragraph, because direct quotes have to have their own citations. Okay, now let's look at a sample short quote. We're going to change topics here, mainly because this is the topic, this is the passage that I'm going to use in discussing various ways to format short quotes. And the reason I'm doing that is because of the way the sentence is structured. Okay? And I'll be doing that in a separate presentation. Let's just take a look at a sample short quote without necessarily looking at the original, because after all, since it's a direct quote, we can assume that the wording is exactly the same. So pause the video for a second and take a look and read through this. And yes, by the way, this is true. I'm not making this up. And I'm not using it to slam Reagan. This is a sample where a direct quote is necessary because how something is said is controversial. When someone is saying that a world leader is making a joke about completely destroying another country, it's very important that the writer make it clear that they're not putting words in the world leader's mouth. This is a very important statement, and it could have caused some really serious consequences. So it's very, very, very important in that case to quote the president directly. And let's look at how the quote is set up. First of all, it's introduced with the name of the person who said it, and it's said because it's something that a human being stated one time. It is past. Unlike something that is written down, the actual saying isn't going on every time somebody reads about it. It's something that was said one time. That's a nitpicky little thing I'm not going to take off for it, and chances are most professors wouldn't even notice it. But you're here to learn how to write, so I may as well teach you as much as I can so that you get the best bang for your buck for taking the class, right? Okay, so you have Reagan said, comma, open quotation marks. Now, this is a complete sentence. In fact, it's a couple of sentences. So we begin it with a capital letter. And he says, my fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. Period. We begin bombing in 5 minutes. Close quotation mark. And then there's the citation. This actual, the information in this paragraph was taken from the front page of the New York Times on August 12th, 1984. This was really big news around the world that he had made this joke. Okay. And then there's a statement that's not part of the quote, where the New York Times notes that the international press, and actually people all around the world, were really appalled that the president said this. And the reason that I included this is because it's important to note that even though the citation for the direct quote and the citation for everything else in this paragraph are exactly the same, the quote gets its own citation. The citation for the quote doesn't cover the rest of the paragraph, and the citation for the paragraph doesn't cover the direct quote. Because here you're saying, this is where I took these exact words word for word from. And here you're saying, this is where I got all of the information in this paragraph. That's why you have to have 2 citations, even though they're exactly the same. Now, pardon me again. We're going to go over this in more detail in another brief presentation on formatting quotes that you'll be looking at in a few minutes. But let me give you some explanation about formatting a long quote. First of all, as I said, it's going to be demonstrated in a separate presentation. A long quote is any quote of 4 or more typed lines in MLA. It's introduced by a signal phrase at the end of a paragraph, such as, according to Bloom, with a colon. And here we're saying that this is not the first time that we've referred to Harold Bloom in the paper, which is why all that other information isn't there. Has nothing to do with it being a long quote. Okay. Then after you have that signal phrase that says, according to Bloom, quote, you have your quote of 4 or more typed lines. And the entire quote is indented at ½ an inch from the left margin. Okay. The quote is double-spaced. You don't single-space it. You do double-space it, but you indent all the lines of the quote ½ an inch from the left margin. And you don't enclose it in quotation marks because the indenting takes the place of the quotation marks. And then, of course, it ends with its own in-text citation. I hope this presentation has helped you determine how to prepare your sources, to gather data from them to develop your paper, and then how to actually format the information and use the information from the sources to transfer it into your paper. Of course, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and you know you contact me at deborah.oakey@csn.edu, and you, of course, contact me from an account other than Canvas. If you want to, don't hesitate to send me a screenshot or a copy or whatever of data, of a passage of data from a source, and a paragraph of what you're going to put in your paper, and ask me if you've done a good job of summarizing or paraphrasing, or if you formatted a quote directly. I'll be more than happy to answer those questions for you. That's what I'm here for. Also, keep in mind that the Writing Center on any of the 3 campuses can help you with that. And Smart Thinking also can help you with that, which is an online tutorial service that you can access online directly from Canvas. Okay, do email me if you have any questions. Thank you so much for paying attention to this presentation. And we'll be talking very shortly about how to format different types of quotations.